Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the place where we turn massive stacks of research and analysis into crystal clear, essential knowledge. We're all deeply familiar with that scenario. You set aside an hour for, focused, productive work, only to find yourself an hour later having absorbed nothing, just mentally jumping from one shallow pool of information to the next.
It's the defining tension of our current era, isn't it? We live in this world that offers infinite information, constant connectivity, yet we feel so, intensely fragmented, exhausted, mentally diminished even. And that feeling, that chronic mental exhaustion and that scattered state of being is exactly what we are dissecting today. Our mission for this deep dive is to shortcut you past all the academic reading and deliver the core conceptual insights from a really comprehensive critique of modern attention culture. It's one rooted in Matthew Crawford's defining and, challenging work, The World Beyond Your Head. And it's crucial to establish that right up front. The sources show this book is not some light self-help manual. If you came here looking for a simple 5-step process for organizing your inbox, you might be in for a surprise. What we're here to do is explore a deep philosophical and psychological critique of why we are so distracted. Yeah. It's not just about how to manage the symptoms.
Right.
The argument is that this is a systemic problem. Yeah. It's woven into the very fabric of our society. It's not just a personal failure of willpower.
We're looking for that intellectual scaffolding that explains this widespread exhaustion. The core tension we're investigating is why, despite having unlimited access to knowledge, we often feel like we have less capacity for deep thought than ever before.
Well, Crawford's work is what you might call a necessary wake-up call for the digital age. It takes the responsibility, or maybe the blame, off the shoulders of the individual, and it places it squarely on the design of our environment. His premise is pretty shocking because it posits that distraction is not some unfortunate accidental byproduct of new technology. Rather, it is the deliberate, core divine principle of our modern environment.
Wow. So distraction is the structure, not the flaw. That's a powerful pivot. So before we even try to figure out how to reclaim our attention, we need to understand exactly what is being stolen and why. Okay, let's unpack this.
We have to start where Crawford starts, with the commodification of focus. The central argument is that the modern systems that, dominate our waking hours, specifically smartphones, social media platforms, relentless advertising, all those constant notifications, have successfully taken the messy, internal state of human attention and transformed it. They've turned it into a quantifiable, treatable commodity.
So if our attention is a commodity, then we're looking at an economy that's built on harvesting that focus. For you, the listener, this means when you use a free service, you are absolutely paying for it. And the payment is your sustained, focused time. Our attention is the raw material being aggressively mined and sold, often to the highest bidder in the form of these hyper-optimized advertisements.
That is the perfect way to put it. These systems are not designed to serve you a useful search result and then send you on your way. They are designed to keep you tethered, to maximize what they call time on platform. Because every single second you spend there is a data point, an exposure opportunity, a moment that can be sold. You have corporations and highly sophisticated algorithms engaged in what is essentially a zero-sum war for our focus, and they're using behavioral science to make sure they win.
And the symptom we all recognize, that chronic mental fragmentation, that's the direct result of this zero-sum war. The feeling of being constantly pulled between 3 screens, 4 different apps, a dozen external obligations. It's just exhausting.
It is utterly exhausting. The mind is not built for perpetual toggling. The sources really emphasize that this constant switching between shallow stimuli, a quick alert, a trending headline, an algorithmically generated suggestion, it prevents the neurological machinery from settling into a state of sustained, singular engagement. And this doesn't just make you tired, it measurably diminishes your capacity for deep thought, for complex synthesis, or sustained contemplation. We lose the habit of focusing deeply.
So the fragmentation isn't just an annoyance, it's genuinely eroding our intellectual capacity by preventing the necessary downtime for cognitive consolidation. But let's challenge that for a moment. Doesn't this sound like we're just blaming the tools? We always hear, it's just a lack of willpower. Crawford explicitly pushes back against that personal failing narrative, right?
Yeah, he absolutely does, and this is a crucial pivot in his analysis. We are conditioned to feel personal guilt, to blame our willpower. But the design of these systems is inherently manipulative. Distraction, as we said, is not an accident. We're dealing with systems engineered by brilliant minds whose primary key performance indicator is maximizing engagement, often at the expense of our well-being.
They're engineered to be addictive, period. We often talk about the infinite scroll, but let's talk about the specific architecture here. If the goal is maximizing time on site, then every single element, from the psychological pull of that little red notification dot to the variable reward schedule of content delivery, it's all aimed at preventing cognitive closure.
Precisely. Closure is the enemy of engagement. If you feel like you've completed a task or finished reading an article, you might leave. So the engineering works to ensure there is always one more thing, one more comment, one more suggestion, one more piece of news that demands a micro slice of your focus. These are intentional design principles, built specifically to prevent you from reaching a natural, self-directed stopping point. Your attention remains perpetually tethered.
Which means we need to analyze the implication here. Attention is power. If the system's goal is to keep me clicking, not necessarily to inform or help me, then the person or entity controlling that focus is controlling a lot more than just my screen time.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the stakes escalate immediately. Whoever manages to capture and retain our attention controls our access to information, they influence our immediate decisions, they shape our emotional state, and they ultimately guide our behavior. These modern systems are fundamentally designed to distract us from our own agency by keeping us in a perpetual reactive state. If you're constantly reacting to external pings, you are not acting deliberately or thoughtfully.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if this theft and fragmentation is systemic, the consequences can't possibly be limited to just personal productivity. The book argues attention isn't just a personal skill, it's a moral and public commodity. What does Crawford even mean by moral value?
This moves the conversation out of the realm of self-improvement and into, well, civics and philosophy. Crawford argues that attention holds moral value because it is the fundamental resource required for self-possession and virtue. To act as a truly free, responsible, and moral agent, an individual must be capable of clear thought, sustained reflection, and deep engagement. Without the internal space to weigh actions, consider consequences, and resist those knee-jerk impulses, how can you be truly responsible for your choices?
So when that internal space is constantly being invaded by external demands, by pings, and this engineered sense of urgency, it doesn't just make us less productive. It fundamentally compromises our ability to be self-governing. We become less free, morally speaking.
Exactly. When the capacity for clear focus is lost, the capacity for reasoned engagement with others, for forming a nuanced opinion that handles complexity and ambiguity, is also lost. We default to the quickest, most emotionally satisfying, or the most tribal response.
Which brings us directly to the democratic warning that Crawford raises, and it's a very stark assessment of the societal risk.
It is. The book warns that democracy itself is at risk when citizens cannot focus, reflect, or resist manipulation. Let's just walk through the cognitive mechanism here. Democratic decision-making requires citizens to synthesize diverse, often conflicting information, to weigh long-term benefits against immediate costs, and to tolerate complexity.
That sounds like sustained, deep work.
It is. But when attention is fragmented, the brain favors simplicity, emotional reactivity, and confirmation bias. If you cannot sustain focus long enough to read a policy paper, you're forced to rely on emotionally charged headlines or sound bites. And this leaves the citizenry uniquely vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation techniques, those designed specifically to bypass reflection and trigger immediate emotional responses.
So the inability to focus is functionally the same as an inability to process complexity. It's not about losing the ability to read a long novel, it's losing the capacity to engage meaningfully with complex civic problems like climate policy or economic reform.
It's about losing the tools of self-governance. When an electorate is distracted, it becomes a pliable electorate. The lack of what you might call attention literacy, the inability to say, no, that ping is not more important than this complex thought I'm trying to hold. It means citizens are constantly surrendering their cognitive space to whoever can shout the loudest or flash the brightest.
That completely reframes our understanding of distraction. It's not a personal failing, it's a failure of civic infrastructure, almost. We often talk about media literacy, but you're saying the foundational requirement for a functioning, deliberative democracy is truly attention literacy. The self-possession required to choose where and how we deploy our mental resources.
The ability to choose relevance rather than being chosen by relevance, that's the core act of intellectual sovereignty. If we cannot manage our focus, we are, by definition, less free, and the mechanisms of public discourse become completely distorted.
So, if we accept that these systems are actively engineered to hijack our attention, then the outside world, our daily environment. It starts to look less like a neutral setting and more like an aggressor constantly trying to overwhelm our senses.
And this brings us to the fifth core theme of the analysis. Public spaces are mentally polluted. Crawford is very clear that this phenomenon extends far beyond the digital devices in our pockets. It permeates the entire physical world we inhabit. It's an ambient, pervasive invasion of our cognitive space.
I was just at a coffee shop this morning, and even waiting in line, there were 3 different screens running news loops, 2 different audio tracks competing, and advertisements flashing on the digital menu. You realize you are actively processing stimuli you never asked for.
That's the perfect illustration. The environment, from gigantic physical billboards demanding our optical attention to screens constantly streaming information in transit hubs, gas stations, even elevators. It relentlessly invades our mental space. Focused thought, which historically was the default state in quiet, reflective physical settings. A library, a park bench, has now become a constant battle, a strenuous, energy-draining battle against ambient noise and invasive stimulus.
The critical point is the mental overhead, right? We have to actively filter the world just to hold a single thought. That active filtering must be exhausting.
It is deeply exhausting. Think of it as cognitive debt. We're continuously performing triage on incoming information, deciding what to ignore, what to process, and what we might need later. This constant filtering and management of environmental noise substantially drains our cognitive resources that should be available for creative problem solving or deep reflection. It is a form of environmental stress that modern urban life requires us to endure continuously, often, subconsciously.
So if the outside world is structurally hostile to focus, if it's this polluted environment, what's the internal response? How do we fight back against this overwhelming external pressure?
The internal antidote, according to Crawford, is discipline. And that leads directly to the core theme. Freedom requires discipline. This concept fundamentally challenges the common, modern, consumer-driven definition of freedom.
And how does that popular definition of freedom look, the one he opposes? It's usually defined as doing whatever you want or having endless choices at your fingertips.
That definition, he argues, is the trap. Crawford suggests that doing whatever you want often translates to following the path of least resistance, the path of impulse. In the digital age, the path of impulse is precisely the one laid out by the algorithms and corporations manipulating your desires. So if your impulses are being externally guided, your freedom to follow them is nothing more than sophisticated subservience.
That is such a powerful reframing sophisticated subservience. Can you give the listener an example of that in practice?
Sure. Consider the act of research. Sophisticated subservience means automatically clicking the recommended article that pops up next, or simply accepting the first few results from an optimized search engine query, even if they're sponsored or emotionally tailored. True freedom, or discipline, means actively seeking out contradictory sources, spending the time to read the full context, and deliberately choosing a path other than the one the system nudges you toward. The digital environment, by constantly simplifying choice, promotes this subservience.
So if true freedom isn't endless choice or following the optimized impulse, what is the alternative definition that Crawford offers?
True freedom, in the context of attention, is defined as being able to direct your attention deliberately. It is the sovereign act of choosing what you focus on, when you focus on it, and for how long, regardless of the siren song of immediate demands or the demands screamed at you by the polluted environment.
And that ability is far from innate. It demands cultivation, and crucially, it demands discipline. It requires saying no, not just to the external temptation of the notification, but to the internal urge for that quick, shallow gratification.
It's the mechanism by which the individual reclaims sovereignty over their own consciousness. If you lack the discipline to command your attention, then you are simply responding to the most aggressive external stimulus. And you are, by definition, being controlled by forces outside your head.
This all ties back into the necessity of creating space, internal mental space, for genuine creation and reflection, a space that the environment is actively trying to erase.
Exactly. And that space is defined by silence, boredom, and the creative gap.
I think boredom is one of the greatest casualties of the smartphone era. We've completely eradicated boredom from modern life. The moment we're waiting in a queue or sitting on the tube or waiting for a friend, the reflex is immediate, almost physical. Pull out the phone and fill the gap.
And in doing so, we are eliminating the necessary precursor to original thought and deep reflection. We need to remember that silence and boredom are not negative vacuums to be immediately filled. They are incubation chambers for the mind. When the mind is denied external stimulation, it begins to churn and synthesize internally.
So if the environment is constantly supplying optimized stimulation, if we are always consuming content tailored exactly to our stated interests, then where does the cognitive friction come from? How do we break free of the consumption loop to generate an original idea, one that isn't just a reaction or a synthesis of something we just saw?
It emerges from that deliberate moment of non-stimulation. When the mind is not being fed, it turns inward to solve problems, to make novel connections between disparate ideas, or to work through complex personal narratives. When we are constantly feeding the mind, we're eliminating the mental buffer required for the slow, often uncomfortable process of generating originality.
That makes the trade-off painfully clear. The immediate relief of distraction and stimulation comes at the expense of our long-term intellectual and creative potential. It's a Faustian bargain we make hourly, without realizing the long-term cost to our capacity.
It is a trade-off between comfort and capacity. Discipline is uncomfortable, boredom is uncomfortable, but they are the necessary friction that builds the capacity for deep, sustained focus. And that focus is the necessary prerequisite for genuine creative and intellectual agency.
So we've established the systemic problem. Our attention is being commodified by a hostile, polluted environment. We've established the internal tool, needed discipline, and the deliberate cultivation of boredom. Now, where do we apply that discipline? Where do we practice the art of focused attention that builds capacity?
Well, Crawford introduces the central, tangible contrast here. Craftsmanship as the antithesis to digital shallowness. The book posits that resistance against digital fragmentation is best practiced through engagement with activities that demand skill, patience, and absolute presence in the real physical world.
Right, because digital engagement is typically shallow. It's quick dopamine hits, endless scrolling, easily digestible information that requires minimal effort. Craftsmanship, conversely, demands that you confront the stubborn, tangible, unforgiving reality of the world.
That confrontation with reality is paramount. Skilled, meaningful work acts as a form of genuine, robust resistance. It grounds the individual, forcing them to submit their intentions, their timelines, their egos, to the uncompromising requirements of the task itself. If you are tuning a complex engine, or shaping a piece of wood, the material world does not care about your notification settings or how fast you want the job done. It only cares about physics and precision.
It's work that pushes back against the user, forcing accountability. You can't hack it or speed it up with some algorithmic shortcut. Mastery requires genuine, sustained time and friction.
And that friction is the forge of attention. The source material highlights specific, relatable, real-world examples of deep attention to illustrate this focused mastery. It demonstrates the diverse ways that real-world complexity demands focus.
Let's start with mechanics, as Crawford often uses them as a symbol of intellectual engagement with the real world. What does the mechanic teach us about attention and agency?
Mechanics deal with deep, systemic, tangible reality. Often complex systems hidden from immediate view, requiring diagnosis through inference and deep sensory attention. A mechanic diagnosing a subtle engine issue cannot rely on a headline or a quick Google search to solve a novel, sputtering problem. They must engage in methodical, focused problem-solving that requires patience, sensory acuity, listening to the engine, feeling the vibrations, and logical analysis.
And the beauty is the accountability. They're held accountable by the physical world. The engine either works perfectly or it doesn't. There's no spinning the data.
Exactly. The feedback loop is instantaneous, physical, and unambiguous. That tangible stake is the antithesis of the digital world, where you can quickly post, delete, or pivot to the next shiny thing without real consequence or immediate physical accountability for your error. The engine is a relentless, objective judge of your focus and your understanding.
Okay, and what about surgeons? That takes the idea of precision, complexity, and stakes to an entirely different existential level.
Surgeons are perhaps the purest epitome of the extreme demand for precision and sustained focus. The work mandates filtering out every single internal and external distraction, fatigue, personal worries, ambient noise, to maintain total, uninterrupted presence in the task at hand. There's zero tolerance for fragmentation, because the consequences of even momentary distraction are immediate and irreversible.
Their work demands an absolute suppression of the internal monologue in favor of perfect execution of skill. That sustained, high-stakes focus must train the mind to a standard that makes digital distractions seem completely irrelevant.
It creates an almost unassailable benchmark. Once an individual has trained their attention to operate reliably at that level where sustained presence is literally life or death, the shallow, manipulated demands of the digital sphere seem trivial, easy to disregard, and not worth the cognitive expenditure. It is an inoculation against distraction through practice necessity.
And we also see athletes mentioned connecting the physical to the mental mastery. How does athletic training relate to this focused attention?
The mastery of physical skill requires the deep, present moment attention of the mind. Think of the focus required to hit a professional-level curveball, or execute a complex diving routine, or maintain a precise pace and form during a marathon. The athlete must achieve total synchronization between mind and body, requiring an iterative learning process, repetitive focus, and an acute sensitivity to subtle physical reality. They are mastering their internal state, the pain, the fatigue, the self-doubt, as much as the external action.
They learn to control what enters their focus and what they filter out during high-pressure moments. It's supplied high-stakes attention control.
Precisely. And finally, the general term craftsman, which captures the long, patient journey to mastery in fields like woodworking, instrument repair, or even bespoke software development.
That long arc is so crucial because the digital world promotes instant expertise.
Well, skilled work, regardless of the field, is characterized by slow, incremental progress. It often involves failure, repetition, and the necessity of confronting one's own incompetence. This journey itself teaches focus and patience by demanding it. It forces the individual to respect the process, the timeline, and the material over their desire for immediate gratification.
So the key isn't just doing the work, but understanding that these activities instill specific qualities that are fundamentally antithetical to the distracted environment. Skilled work teaches focus, patience, responsibility, and deep, deserved pride.
These are the very qualities that digital distraction systematically erodes. If everything is instant, patience is unnecessary. If the task is low stakes and reversible, responsibility is diluted. If the effort is minimal, the pride is fleeting. Craftsmanship reverses that erosion by demanding these qualities as non-negotiable prerequisites for excellence.
Which brings us back to identity, a concept that's central to the book's title, The World Beyond Your Head. If we spend all our time passively consuming content, our identity is defined by what we like, what we watch, and what we buy. But if we spend time mastering something, our identity shifts dramatically.
The key lesson here is that meaningful work builds identity and confidence through objective achievement. The confidence gained through mastery, the durable knowledge that you can reliably interact with the material world and produce something of lasting value, is a deep, stable, internal form of fulfillment.
True fulfillment, then, comes from disciplined attention and mastery, not from the endless fleeting stimulation or passive consumption that characterizes the attention economy. It's the difference between feeling good about what you created versus what you saw or liked.
Fulfillment rooted in achievement is durable. Fulfillment rooted in optimized consumption is fragile and addictive. The disciplined attention required by any form of craftsmanship results in a profound sense of agency and self-possession that simply cannot be replicated by notifications or tailored feeds. You are the author of your own action, not merely a recipient of external stimuli.
This has been a dense but critically important discussion, moving from the philosophical critique of market manipulation to the psychological necessity of craftsmanship. Let's synthesize these conceptual insights into clear takeaways for the learner, for the person trying to navigate this polluted environment every single day.
Right. We need to review the most valuable assets. The number one foundational takeaway, which sounds simple but requires radical behavioral change, is this: your attention is your most valuable asset. Protect it fiercely.
It's remarkable, isn't it, how carefully we budget our money and manage our time, yet we allow our focus to just leak away into the digital ether without a second thought. We treat it as if it were an infinite resource.
And because of the aggressive commodification we detailed earlier, we have to adopt an intensely disciplined, almost defensive posture toward what demands our time. So the second crucial lesson is, not everything that demands attention deserves it. This demands conscious, active choice. You have to assume that anything aggressively demanding your focus has an agenda, and you must deliberately decide if that agenda aligns with your deeply held values or goals.
That is the fundamental shift in posture required. It's moving from a passive, reactive stance, what should I look at now, to a highly proactive, defensive stance. Why is this demanding my attention, and should I allow it to invade my cognitive space?
Exactly. And this proactive defense leads directly to the necessary practical shift required for mental clarity and responsibility.
The sources highlight that constant connectivity weakens deep thinking. We have, through pervasive connectivity, effectively outsourced our need to be alone with our thoughts, and that has a structural consequence.
The capacity to sustain a complex mental structure, to hold multiple variables and abstract concepts in the mind while working through a difficult problem, is fundamentally weakened when we are perpetually available for interruption. Connection is an invitation for interruption, and interruption prevents the formation of those deep, integrated cognitive structures necessary for genuine complexity.
So disconnecting isn't merely some trendy lifestyle choice. Crawford argues it is a structural necessity for maintaining intellectual capacity and mental integrity. This brings us to the application of digital minimalism.
Digital minimalism improves mental clarity, not just by reducing time on devices, but by establishing profound protective boundaries that honor the integrity of your own thoughts. It is a philosophical necessity to protect the internal workspace of the mind from continuous external invasion. By deliberately limiting connection points and reducing the number of aggressive external stimuli, you increase the stable, quiet bandwidth available for genuine reflection and complex thought.
And this entire philosophy requires acknowledging that the stakes are incredibly high, far beyond simple personal productivity gains.
Yes, we have to re-emphasize the moral responsibility of focus. Learning to focus is, in the framework of the book, a moral and civic responsibility. It is the necessary prerequisite for acting as a fully developed, responsible, self-governing individual in a complex society. If you are easily manipulated by aggressive external forces, you cannot be a truly free participant in the public sphere, nor can you be a responsible agent in your own life.
This is a powerful full-circle realization. Our inability to focus certainly impacts our productivity, but more profoundly, it diminishes our capacity to govern ourselves, to form complex opinions, and to participate meaningfully in the public life of the community.
And the final key lesson, tying everything back to the idea of craftsmanship in Part 3. Freedom comes from mastery, not consumption. The disciplined engagement with reality, the deliberate practice of focus through skill, whether it's in your career, your hobby, or your relationships, is the only reliable path to genuine agency and self-possession. That is where you rebuild the cognitive machinery that the attention economy has attempted to erode.
Before we wrap up, it's worth quickly addressing the intellectual context of this powerful argument. How is The World Beyond Your Head received, especially since it's such a challenging read?
Well, the critical reception and engagement show it was widely praised for its profound depth and originality. Reviewers described it as intellectually rigorous and thought-provoking, applauded for connecting classical philosophy, contemporary psychology, and real-world examples in a compelling and non-simplistic manner. It wasn't just a commentary on social media, it was a deep philosophical treatise on what it means to be human in a saturated world.
But with that depth comes the inevitable critique, which, ironically, often proves the book's central point.
Yes. The main criticism acknowledged in the sources is that it is dense, philosophical, and requires slow, focused engagement. Reviewers noted it is explicitly not a quick read. It demands the very rigorous attention it advocates for.
That's the deepest irony, isn't it? The book demanding the most rigorous attention is the one critiquing the culture of attention deficit. It essentially forces the reader to practice the very discipline being preached.
It does. It requires conceptual insight, which can only be achieved through sustained, non-fragmented reading. This slow, deliberate engagement is what makes its insight so durable and valuable, rather than simply offering a list of fleeting productivity hacks.
We've covered vast ground today, from the predatory commodification of focus to the civic stakes of distraction, and the profound, grounding resistance offered by engaging in real-world craftsmanship. If we had to distill the one overarching insight from this comprehensive source material, it would be this. A mind that is constantly distracted cannot possibly live a meaningful, self-directed life.
That's the perfect synthesis, because meaning requires durable, sustained engagement with things that matter. And since Crawford challenges the very environment we inhabit, the real deep dive for you, the listener, begins when you start actively identifying the specific mechanisms by which your attention is being bought, where the systems are designed to harvest your focus, not just where it is being passively spent.
It's true. We spend our time meticulously negotiating the price of everything, from groceries to mortgages, but our attention is often taken for free, or worse, sold back to us as engineered, exhausting distraction.
So the final provocation I'll leave you with is this. Think about the 3 or 4 most essential, complex systems or activities in your life. Your profession, a committed relationship, a deep hobby, a civic commitment. Which one of those systems demands true, deep, dedicated, uninterrupted presence? What discipline does that activity enforce upon you? And how does the profound sense of stability, responsibility, and confidence that deep engagement instills in you compare to the fleeting exhaustion that comes from the endless scrolling in a polluted environment?
Use that feeling of mastery as your North Star to guide your attention. Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.